Welcome to the Deep End by OnDeck, a podcast for visionary builders, creators, and thinkers to discuss world-changing stories and ideas. I'm your host, Marshall Kozlov.
And uniquely, there's kind of one entity in the market that does care about, your health and preventing you from getting sick, and that's your insurance company. Your health insurance company takes risk out on you every year, and they say, if you get sick, I'm going to be responsible for paying that bill. And so it's in their best interest to do the easy, smaller things up front, like make sure you get a physical every 6 months, or help you manage your chronic condition in order to prevent that really expensive thing from happening, which is you having a critical illness or an accident and then having to go to the hospital. That's bad for you, bad for your health, and then obviously bad for the insurance companies.
OnDeck is where ambitious people worldwide go to start companies, find their next roles, and invest in their careers. The Deep End invites the founders, operators, and investors from the OnDeck community and beyond to turn their experiences into the ideas others need to start their own odysseys. Joining me in the Deep End today is Amrit Singh, a co-founder of Loop Health, the fastest growing health insurance startup in India. Our discussion today is about what it's like to be a founder in India and what the startup ecosystem there looks like relative to the United States. India is an interesting paradox because although it's a massive country in terms of population, containing almost 1 in 5 living people, that doesn't always equate to a huge market size in terms of available spend. We'll also talk about the state of healthcare in India in a world where medical inflation is leading to the cost of care doubling every 5 years, even though quality is not doubling 2 times better, and how the fee-for-service model perpetuates perverse incentives in healthcare all around the world. We discussed Loop's mission to help change this with a philosophy around value-based healthcare that focuses on preventing sickness instead of merely reacting to it. It's a great episode for anyone interested in company building amidst the challenges and opportunities of building in emerging markets like India, or just valuable insights on being a founder and what it takes to succeed. Let's dive in. Amrit Singh, welcome to the Deep End.
Thank you so much. Really happy to be here.
Yeah, great to speak with you too. I want to start by focusing on your background, your experiences. You're currently coming to us from the United States, but you're also based in India. You moved there during the pandemic, according to a blog post you put on your website. It's funny, we've done a lot of I moved to Austin. I moved to Miami. I'm staying in New York versus San Francisco, but you went to India. Could you talk through just like the thought process, and then we'll get to the actual experience?
Yeah, sure. I think I'll just share kind of what led up to me making that decision. I'm actually, of Indian descent. So parents and family are all from India. Spent a bunch of time growing up in India, when I was growing up, spent a couple of years there in Maharashtra and Mumbai and Nagpur. And, but most of the time I was in Illinois, Chicago suburbs, and I ended up going to school in Champaign, which is, obviously a small town, a couple hours south of Chicago. And I met a gentleman there named Mayank, who is now my co-founder at Loop. So, got to know about the Indian landscape and opportunities to build businesses in India through him when we were in school about a decade ago, and then spent the better part of the last decade trying to start companies, and then spending some time in venture, and then kind of coming back to this really exciting idea to build a better kind of healthcare system in India. So he convinced me and another friend of ours who's from the US to move to India and join him on this crazy mission to kind of bring better healthcare to the Indian market. And so there's actually 4 of us co-founders, 2 from the US and 2 from India, which is a lot of fun. So that's how I ended up there.
It's funny. I think all of us in the audience, and myself included, have an image of what one does when one moves to like a startup hub. So if you're, in Miami, you'll take a picture on a boat. If you're moving to Brooklyn, you'll take a picture by the Dumbo Bridge. There's obviously like the classic like SF, like Mission Hill bit. What was actually the experience like during the actual the height of the pandemic, moving to India?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, India is a really vibrant place. And I think Mumbai, I was in Pune for a year and then Mumbai now, I think a lot of stuff was shut down in the pandemic. So I didn't really get to experience life in India. We were mostly, flipping between an apartment and the office, which was largely empty since most folks were working from home. And it was cool because over the last few years, kind of two things had happened. One, we ended up building, a pretty large team. So scaled from just a couple of us to now 250 folks on the team, doing a lot of that hiring through the pandemic and trying to figure out this hybrid work model with some office space, but mostly people working at home, and kind of building culture and the company mostly remotely. And then second, kind of in the last few years, also kind of seeing life come back into society in India, restaurants open, nightlife open, more things to do and more kind of places to explore and try. So I'm really getting my India experience in the last year, not the first year I was there, and doing it with now a pretty big team at Loop, which is exciting. So it's been really fun. I think there are a bunch of things you got to do when you come to Mumbai, but I think my favorite is, find a safe street food stall and get some amazing chaat or pani puri, and just try that experience because it's some of the best food in the world.
I think what's interesting here is we've done a broader episode, speaking of people like Balaji Srinivasan, Anand, just about from General Catalyst, about this idea of hey, there's going to be a generation of Indian diaspora, individuals moving back, doing what you're doing. When we've spoken with Anand and Balaji, it's been very kind of hypothetical and top level. It's more narrative driven. Mm-hmm. What have been in your experience, the promise and maybe the gap between this top line narrative that we see on Twitter or on podcasts and this actual experience that I think a lot of people are thinking about?
Yeah. I think it's really interesting. I also don't know that many folks that have been born and raised in the US and then have moved to India. I've heard of a lot of folks kind of growing up in India, spending a few years in the US and then moving back. So this is, altogether a pretty interesting experience for our families who had kind of moved to America with the promise of the American dream, building, a life for themselves here, and then their kids decide to move back to India, which is a fun conversation. But I think, like you pointed out, it is the country with the largest diaspora, and also a company that is, from a GDP perspective, growing incredibly fast and represents, 1 in 5 people in the world, and is largely a place where, we're starting to see the startup scene and venture develop rapidly, but is still I would say a decade or two behind the US in its robustness, but the size and the scale of the market is massive. And so there's a lot of opportunity to go and build really interesting things there. And we can get into more of this over the course of this conversation, but in healthcare in particular, you have this massive group of people that have historically not had access to great healthcare, great primary care, but medical inflation is increasing, 15-16% year on year in India. So things are getting, effectively, the cost of care is doubling every 5 years. The quality of care is not getting 2 times better. The lifespan of a person is not increasing by 2x, but everything is becoming more expensive. And so there are these kind of real infrastructural problems to solve there, which maybe isn't really as big of an issue in the US, where people do have access to care largely, and people do have relatively high quality care, at least compared to what people are getting in India. So the promise of the problems you get to work on and the scale of those issues is really real. But I would say maybe the thing that's overstated is, how big some of these markets are by size, by the number of people, it's huge, but actually the amount of spend in the system is not that much. And so you have to be kind of very careful where you play in India, because some markets are sort of deceptively small. You would expect these markets to be massive in the US, but isn't necessarily the case in India, just based on how much spending power there is. So there is that nuance, I think.
And that's interesting because, on your same Moving to India blog post, you talked about how you could see there being, 100 additional unicorns in India by 2030. And I think that speaks to both the fact that there's a gap on the timeline that you're describing, but also there's a lot of opportunity. What are some examples of, without needing to name specific companies that may have struggled, what are some deceptive spaces where you could see, like, put your, VC hat on, like, where's a space where you could see very obviously someone saying, hey, the population is 1 billion, the market, the TAM is like 300 million. Like, what's a deceptive example you've come across?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think, in the US, you look at healthcare now, and the costs have inflated to such a scale that, like, serving, one population in one city is enough to build a massive business. One segment of a population, like, you build a Medicare a plan and serve maybe 30,000 or 50,000 seniors in a given city, and you generate enough value that you can actually IPO. There are a couple of businesses in the US that have IPO'd, like insurance companies that have IPO'd with like 100,000 members.
Wow.
Insured. You can't do that in India. You have to reach a much, much, much bigger scale to be able to generate enough value for the company. And I would also say, like, SaaS also is deceptive. I think there are a lot of businesses in India, but they don't all have the same ability to spend on software that you would in the US. And so the ticket sizes end up being lower on average. And then you end up seeing, not a tremendous amount of value in these more niche SaaS products. A lot of the great SaaS companies that have come out of India actually sell internationally. So they, like, build global products and they sell globally, but then their sales teams and their product teams are based in India. And that's how they kind of make the numbers work. So those two categories, I think, come to mind, but I think there are a lot of them actually where you have to be really careful.
It's really interesting. I want to speak to that international part here that you're describing here, which is that, Loop Health, like your company, it's in India. Do you see this is India that market you segmented down? Or is there like a world where, like, Loop is providing, your services to, like, not the entire globe? That's a little ambitious, but is this like an India company, or is this like beyond, if you're thinking about this that way?
I think it could expand. I think we're seeing a lot of the same problems in other developing economies in Southeast Asia. But right now, and I think for the near term, we're focused on India. There's, we're just barely scratching the surface on providing care to people and insuring people in India. And so there's a long runway to go. So I would say definitely the next few years is India focused. And also, I think, every time you enter a new market, especially with healthcare and insurance, then there's like question of, like, the kind of managing the regulation and getting the right licenses and trying to navigate all of that, which requires a lot of kind of activation energy entering into a new market, whereas we don't have that problem. In India, actually, what's nice is that everything is kind of federal in insurance and healthcare. So the laws are sort of the same across all the states. So you can kind of practice, you can kind of expand the business without having to change the licensure state by state.
Yeah. And let's actually just get a straightforward explanation of, like, what Loop Health actually does beyond just the categories we've been discussing it.
Yeah, sure. So I think maybe I mentioned this, but the cost of care is really inflating quickly in India. And so you see people, paying 2 times more than they were paying for the same procedure 5 years ago, and quality not getting much better. And this is all before the pandemic, right? Medical inflation has been 15-16% year on year. In the US, where costs are insanely high, we've never seen medical inflation of 15% in a given year. And so, you can expect that if that trajectory continues in India, that care is just going to be super inaccessible to a large group of people. But also you see the prevalence of health insurance becoming more common. So about 20% of the country now has health insurance, and that also is growing like 30% year on year. And so people are getting the coverage. That market is doubling every 2.5 years. And so I would expect that health insurance becomes a commodity for most of the country in the next few decades. So that's kind of what the landscape looks like broadly. But the thing we're attacking is, like, when you see a market that is getting more expensive, but quality is decreasing or staying the same, something is fundamentally broken. We look at food delivery in India, or you look at education. These other areas have been touched by technology, and a few companies have come in and built phenomenal products that have made things faster, better, cheaper, more accessible. Healthcare is not like that. It's like the opposite. And when something like that is happening, we know it's fundamentally broken in a way. And it's because of the same problem that kind of follows healthcare everywhere in the world. There's sort of fee-for-service models that are really incentivized around kind of helping people when they're sick and being very reactive.
And sorry, could you explain what fee-for-service means?
Sure. Yeah. It's how any market works, right? You get paid a fee for your service. And in this case, the service is healthcare provided by a hospital or by a doctor, but it's reactive. I get sick, I come in, and I ask for a service. I need help with my sickness. I need help managing my condition, or I need help with an emergency health situation in the hospital, and I pay a fee to that hospital. And it's how most markets work. But in healthcare, what it does is it sort of kind of perpetuates this perverse incentive to really only help people when they get sick, rather than prevent the sickness altogether. That is to say, like, if I'm sick in Mumbai or you're sick in Mumbai and we're not doing well, the more sick that we get, the more money the healthcare system stands to make, when really what it should be doing is preventing sickness altogether. And uniquely, there's kind of one entity in the market that does care about, your health and preventing you from getting sick. And that's your insurance company. Your health insurance company takes risk out on you every year. And they say, if you get sick, I'm going to be responsible for paying that bill. And so it's in their best interest to do the easy, smaller things up front, like make sure you get a physical every 6 months, or help you manage your chronic condition, in order to prevent that really expensive thing from happening, which is you having a critical illness or an accident and then having to go to the hospital. That's bad for you, bad for your health, and then obviously bad for the insurance company. So what we've done is we've said, we can build what's called integrated care or value-based care in India. This is like a model that's kind of become more popular in the US and in other developed economies, which is create a system that's really oriented around preventing sickness by bundling insurance with great primary care and having the real kind of business level incentive of providing phenomenal healthcare to people. And as a result, making the insurance product you're selling more profitable, then maybe in the future lowering the cost of insurance and making insurance more accessible, and kind of kicking off this flywheel of better care, cheaper insurance, healthier people.
And something I'm curious about is, could you just, as much as you can possibly tell, could basically give broader context on India's relationship towards healthcare? So, for example, in the United States, any explanation of these markets would begin with, well, during World War II, there was a freeze on wage increases. So the government made it so that companies could offer health insurance. That led to a primarily employer-based system in the United States. That's why your employer offers, and it's a little more difficult to do it on the open market. How does this history play out in India?
Yeah. It's funny, it's very kind of dependent on what happened in the US. So because of the employer-led model in the US, what we see is that, European MNCs, like multinational corporations from America and Europe, showed up in India in the 90s, mostly because of the IT boom. And they started offering health benefits through employers, because they wanted to attract and retain high quality talent. And so you have this domino effect of the largest kind of international conglomerates showing up in India, offering this benefit, and then that kind of going all the way downhill to the mid-sized companies and the India-based companies who are now trying to compete for that talent and also offer health benefits. And so really it's kind of an extension of what the popularity of employer-led insurance plans in other countries. And on the insurer side, insurers are much happier to insure a group of people than an individual person, right? So as health insurance becomes more popular, ultimately we believe it's a really, really great instrument for financial protection. And I think the government also believes that and supports the growth of health insurance. You have two choices, get insurance from my employer or get insurance on the market myself as a retail customer. And insurers would much rather price risk of a group of people and pooled people together than to price risk for an individual. So group insurance is always cheaper, always has better benefits, more coverage. And so people much prefer to kind of get insurance through their employer. And that's why that it's become so popular. And now it's grown to cover, 1/5 of the population in just the last 2.5 decades. Mm-hmm. And I think it's growing faster and faster now, year on year, as more people understand that it's really valuable. And I think it'll continue to be employer-led.
And something I'm curious about too is what is the Indian? And once again, like you're not a public policy expert, so I appreciate you delving into this. But what is the Indian government's relationship towards the healthcare market? So, for example, like when we were talking about many American healthcare startups or insurtech operations, they're focused on, hey, like there's Medicaid and there's Medicare and there's like this big customer that you could serve. Like, how does that tend to play out in India?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll be careful with answering this because, like you said, I'm not a public policy expert. But for my understanding, there is an equivalent of Medicaid for the lowest, maybe 15% of the population by income level. And so there are government hospitals where you can kind of go and get care. Largely, the quality is not great. And then, from a regulatory standpoint, healthcare, it's funny, insurance is more regulated than healthcare in India. Healthcare is mostly, free market in a sense, in that, you can, there's a lot you can do with technology today immediately. Like if I'm a general practitioner in India, I can consult someone over WhatsApp and I can write them a prescription over WhatsApp. I don't necessarily have to see them in person. I can practice across state lines as a physician, which you can't do in the US. I can store healthcare data in a way that's a little bit easier than HIPAA. Like, there's a general IT Security Act for India.
What's HIPAA?
That guides how you...
What's HIPAA?
HIPAA is a kind of a regulatory framework in the US that guides how you have to store patient health records and health related data. And that's, from what I understand from my friends in the US building in healthcare, that's a pain in the ass. Like there are a lot of rules as to like how you need to save and store that data and move that data. And so we don't really have a lot of those restrictions in India. It's a lot more free market. And so you can build more quickly. I think you can do more with technology immediately, like providing consults over Google Meets. If you want to build a business doing that in the US, you couldn't. So there's a lot of kind of there's free market elements to healthcare in India. And then on the insurer front, I think it's important to mention that the government is largely extremely supportive of insurance. They've obviously already funded healthcare for the bottom of the population, maybe 15-20%, but healthcare or health insurance they see as a public good. And they've about 2 years ago in the pandemic, they required employers to provide health insurance to their employees if they wanted to bring those employees back into the office. And so there's this kind of push towards requiring health insurance that's becoming that's probably going to kind of be more enforced in the next few years. But I think we'll see health insurance be promoted and pushed by the Indian government as like a really, really important financial instrument.
Yeah. And I'm really interested in the interplay between the American health tech, insure tech experience and the experience they all are having in India, because obviously the story of, post internet healthcare in America is kind of interesting, right? There have been all these like big attempts. One of my favorite books is The New Thing by Michael Lewis, and it's basically about the guy Jim Barclay, who founded Netscape, and he does his two big companies, and his third big company is going to be him trying to transform healthcare. It was called Healthion. It eventually becomes WebMD, but it's not as transformative as the book would suggest things would have been in 2000. So just what lessons have you all taken from the American healthcare experience, and how are they playing out in India in your experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think India is where the US was at in like the 70s and 80s, like pre-United Health. Pre like HMO and PPO, which is kind of these fixed networks where if you get insurance coverage from an insurer, basically an HMO or PPO would say you have to use a certain set of providers. And that's ultimately a way for them to try to control costs.
Okay.
And, we're before all of this sort of massive inflation of healthcare costs in the US. Like we're well before that. And insurance also in India only covers catastrophic care, meaning, it only covers like a hospital stay for 24 hours. It doesn't, provide coverage. It doesn't pay for like my visit to a GP, my visit to a specialist. If I go to a lab in India, I have to pay out of pocket. And so insurance also covers a lot less. And so we're really, really, I think, a couple of decades behind, but that allows us the unique opportunity to try to fight against maybe the fee-for-service model we talked about much earlier, to kind of foresee some of the problems that come with the system in the US and try to leapfrog that from the perspective of, one, like the consumer experience of healthcare, making it easy and frictionless, the deployment of like medical records that are easy to access and family health history that's easy to access and share. And then also just try to like, maintain and lower the cost of healthcare over time, which, we haven't seen in the US. So I think these couple things we can start to do a couple decades earlier. And hopefully that means that, maybe by 2050, the Indian healthcare system looks, a lot better than the care you get in the US. So, I think we're at a really unique point in time.
And back to your, personal biography, like what got you interested in this space?
So I actually, after graduating school, I spent time in venture. So I was in VC for a few years, and I was looking at mostly seed stage deals and getting really excited about certain businesses in healthcare. And then I also went through an experience caregiving for a parent. So I had a parent who was diagnosed with a really rare medical condition that only affects 55,000 people worldwide every year. And I spent the better part of a few years being a caregiver and trying to navigate the health system in Chicago, and experiencing the pain points with not having second opinions, not having real guidance, and kind of feeling like there were some massive problems in healthcare I wanted to go and fix. Again, simultaneously, I'm meeting, like in my day job, I'm meeting like phenomenal founders and investors and getting to see the world of entrepreneurship firsthand, and getting excited about doing something on my own, and ended up reconnecting with Mayank, one of my best friends from college, who's from India, who's building health technology in India, trying to build medical records for health systems. And we got really excited, along with our other co-founders, about this idea of this value-based care system that would provide amazing healthcare to people, amazing support, and second opinion services, and bundling that with insurance in a way that allowed us to kind of really incentivize the quality of care and really help us focus on healthcare outcomes instead of just, trying to make as much profit, extract as much profit in healthcare as possible. And that seemed like a really compelling mix of kind of this mission that was aligned towards my personal experiences, but the opportunity to build like a really, really exciting business in a place where really the standard was much lower than what we think we could build.
I want to go to the origin story real quick, because the focus on health records is very important, but that's another example of how the American experience is revealing in that, once again, non-expert, just from what I've heard, picking up conventional wisdom, there was a lot of excitement, like say in the 2010s, about, hey, like electronic medical records are going to produce all these like better outcomes, and we'll have data, and the system's so screwed up. And it was screwed up, but oftentimes these reforms haven't produced the gains that one would have expected, especially when people were the most excited about it. So I'm curious where y'all left that project in India and how that plays out in the experience today with the actual company.
Yeah. I think, there's just kind of from my personal experiences in India, you walk into a doctor's office and they're taking notes on paper still, mostly. They're not entering anything into a medical record.
Something I'd love to hear a little bit about, because we're in the stage where I want to give perspective and advice for folks who aren't just working in insurtech healthcare in India. You were working in venture capital before you became a startup founder. There's this, very heated, very Twitter-centric debate about, does it make sense to like work at a startup? Does it make sense to start in VC? I'm curious how you think your VC experience has positively or maybe even negatively, you're here, so it worked, right? But how has it really affected your ability to be an effective founder?
Mm-hmm. I would say it's definitely not a requirement to go and be a VC before starting a company. I think people would say that. Honestly, I think people say that the same reason a lot of folks that I know kind of went into consulting or banking, which is like, I just want optionality. I don't know what I want to do yet, but I want to like think about it and think about it from a perspective like that lets me see a lot of different things. So I think that's like the kind of the base case argument for a lot of folks is, I'll go into venture, I'll like spend a bunch of time, see a bunch of business models, and then maybe start something after that. which it's a fair argument. I think it works. You do get to see a lot. And I know a lot of folks that kind of finish, one business, maybe the startup goes well or it doesn't go well, doesn't matter, but they end up going to VC for a few years because they want to kind of build a thesis on a certain market or just kind of explore. And it's a decent idea. And it seems to work, but also there's a bunch of founders, I'd say most of the founders I know don't do that, and it seems to work out. So I think, it doesn't matter either way. I think, it presents a lot of benefits, but also, yeah, if I think about some of my favorite founders, actually, the people that I look up to, they have never been VCs, or they've spent a small amount of time as VCs, but like later in their career, and spent most of the time just trying to build, grind, hit their head against the wall for years, trying to figure out a business model that works, and then find something and do their best to scale it up. So I could go either way on this argument. Yeah.
Do you have any, and once again, I'm not expecting the perfect answer, but do you have any like thesis that you've, developed over the, past 10 years or so of your career?
Thesis with respect to what? Like business
Anything.
Building?
Venture, companies, tech?
Good question.
Or maybe even a takeaway. A thesis is pretty heady. Just is there like something you've like taken away from this that's really shaping how you're thinking moving forward?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of like what I've noticed in the last couple of years. There's a lot of this like glorification of startups and entrepreneurship, but it's really just a grind. And I think people say that, and then that also somehow gets kind of twisted into like this, hustle porn. Kind of work is the most important thing in your life kind of idea that people seem to, I don't know. I really feel like people over glorify it, and it is just a bunch of hard work. And I think, was listening to this Cartoon Avatars podcast, which I think maybe you're familiar with. Logan Bartlett was interviewing Zach Weinberg from Flatiron, and he talks about the process of like coming up with the second startup idea for Flatiron. And it's just like 18 months of like grind, interviewing people, asking questions, pitching ideas. And then kind of just this, just suggests that the formula for finding a business model and starting that company is just, it's hard work. It's a lot of questions. It's a lot of listening more than talking, and then pitching to see what sticks. And it really ends up being a lot of that. And if I had to say anything, it would just be like, I've learned that from the outside looking in, things are shiny, but it's actually just a bunch of hard work. And the best people in the space are not, there's a bunch of talented folks in venture, and like all those sort of amazing role models we look up to in venture and on Twitter are like incredibly intelligent, but also they just work so much harder than everyone else. And it's like, you message some of the partners at the best venture funds in the world, and they'll respond to you in 2 minutes or 5 minutes. And it's just incredible to see like people who are kind of even post success working so hard. And it kind of has taught me that before starting a company, and after you've started a successful company or deep into your career, the only way to kind of make progress is to work your ass off. And that's both something it's a bit of a scary realization, but also comforting in a way that like kind of tells me that the harder I work, maybe the better things will turn out.
Yeah. And I think it's what I love about the way you articulated that. You gave me the right answer in just the sense that there's working very hard, but there's also this very like hustle grind culture porn thing where someone's like kind of performing for Twitter, where I think what was key in your answer is it's directed somewhere productive. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a way to segment that. And then also just the point that, like I think everyone's aware of the fact that, a lot of startups are operating in this like this tough economic environment. I'm curious how this is playing out in India, because obviously the dynamics will be slightly different. But there's just a way that you're going to perform as a founder or a VC when things are vibes versus things are not vibes. So like, how is the economic environment? I'm going to say not a literal like technical level, but how is just the general perception of like the economic situation looking like there?
Yeah. I think we're starting to see growth stage startups certainly being impacted already. So we're seeing hiring freezes. We're seeing some layoffs. There were a couple of growth stage companies that raised from, Tiger and these other massive growth stage funds in India that I think were fueling growth artificially to some extent, and we're seeing that kind of slow and stop a little bit. So I think there is going to be an impact to the Indian startup ecosystem as a result of this sort of global slowdown. And, Indian investors also look at like comps in the US market too, when they look at valuations and multiples. Like it's both the India view, but also the kind of global perspective, because many of these companies like Freshworks sells their software product globally. And Freshworks also recently got listed in the US, even though they're based in India. And so, they do look at public comps in the US. And so that's going to definitely affect valuations. It's definitely going to affect how much venture capital gets deployed in the next 18 months and maybe beyond that. And I think founders will have to react. Fortunately, I think at Loop, we're sitting at the nexus of two markets, health insurance and healthcare, that we would expect to see kind of similar amounts of spend in the next couple of years. Like the market should not decrease. People, don't choose when they have to use healthcare services, and health insurance is generally a very kind of great protective financial instrument, which maybe makes more sense in a market like this for employers to offer. And so I think, I think we're feeling okay about things at a macro level, but definitely need to be careful with spend, with burn. Definitely need to be extremely thoughtful as founders with respect to how much cash we can generate in the next few years.
So look, we're nearing the end. So something I'd love to just hear from you on is, because this is an OnDeck podcast, like you were an OnDeck fellow. I'd love to, hear about your OnDeck experience, like why you found it valuable for, I think, navigating like the times we're in, but also like the spaces you're in.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. OnDeck. I was in the second fellowship, I'm pretty sure. And that was like the fellowship right before things went remote. So we were like the last in-person fellowship. And I was in Chicago at the time. And, I remember just feeling like getting to speak with people in SF in New York was so different. Like, because at that time there was just an SF batch and a New York batch. So I had to fly to New York every week or every other week for like the program. So, and I had already quit my venture job. So I was just paying out of pocket for these flights to just be part of this community. And it was so worth it. And I would do it again because I got to connect with so many amazing folks. And a lot of those people have kind of gone on to do really incredible things. One shout out I'll give is like Packy was pitching me Not Boring at the meetup we had in, I think we went to Pennsylvania. We rented like a castle in Pennsylvania. And everyone from the New York batch went there one weekend. It was super fun. And he was talking about Not Boring being a club actually in New York instead of a newsletter. But I think it was a club in a community he was trying to set up. And there are a lot of people like that have gone on to like do really incredible stuff and kind of execute on the things they were pitching, which has been motivating in a sense, because I've gotten to see all these peers kind of grow alongside me as I've also kind of gone out and tried to really execute against this idea. And specifically for healthcare and insurance, a lot of folks in that batch, I recall, were interested in the same spaces. I ended up like really connecting and getting close with a lot of folks who are interested, either coming from a fintech background. A few doctors and PhDs are really kind of deep in healthcare, and getting to jam and just brainstorm for days on end with these really incredible, talented folks was invaluable, and helped me structure my thoughts as to the business we wanted to build, and the business models that were interesting to me. So I owe a lot to OnDeck. I think that couple months that I was kind of between roles trying to figure out what I wanted to do, OnDeck was definitely kind of an anchor in my life and helped me build a community that I could rely on. So really, really, appreciative of the work that you guys have done.
It's funny, two things to wrap. One, every once in a while we'll hear these like very like pre-COVID experiences, and you hopping on a flight every 2 weeks for an in-person experience is the type of thing which I struggle to see happening ever again. Maybe once a month, maybe twice a month, but just like bi-weekly. That's like unimaginably intense relative to these things. And two, I want to give a shout out of my own to the castle in Pennsylvania. I've been there too. It's the
Nice.
so because like when you said like castle, I'm sure people think like, oh, is he just describing like a really big venue or a mansion? Like, no, like we're talking about a like corporate retreat that for whatever reason is like imagine like a theme park. So there's like a fake drawbridge and there's like electronic torch lights. It's like, but there's also like a motel style pool out in the back. So it's a weird, like I generally would love to know the history of this thing, but it's a great venue. So if anyone likes castle aesthetic and is in the greater tri-state area, can't recommend it enough. But Amrit, this has been really great. I think I'll just close with a question about like, looking at your spaces. Like you said, you're between two really interesting markets in a real big opportunity country. What are you most excited about over the next few years?
Man, I think I'm really excited to see us kind of fulfill this vision of like a real healthcare system. We say healthcare system a lot. We talk about longevity and we talk about tracking the North Star metric of like the lifespan of our population. And I think we're in the early innings of doing that. Providing health insurance to people is great. Providing great primary care is great. But I think there's a lot more to build around specific conditions. We're piloting a diabetes program. We're piloting a bunch of other care programs that'll help us deliver really phenomenal high quality care and care that, people in these markets have never necessarily received before. And so just super, super excited about kind of fulfilling the healthcare vision and really building the sort of full healthcare system. You imagine, I think we're familiar with like Kaiser Permanente on the West Coast being a phenomenal, well-renowned healthcare system end to end. They provide care. It's primary care, secondary, tertiary care. Would love to kind of see us do a very similar thing, obviously in a different way, configured for the Indian market, but build a business that's just as enduring and just as high quality.
Great to hear. Amrit, thank you so much for joining us on The Deep End.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.